In the 1950s, the world looked to America as the factory of the future. Cars, steel, electronics, you name it, the US made it. But today, those factories are either abandoned or have moved overseas. So, what happened? How did the United States go from a manufacturing powerhouse to relying on foreign-made goods? And more importantly, can America ever bring those jobs back? After World War II, the United States was on top of the world, literally. While Europe and Japan were rebuilding from the devastation of war, America's factories were running at full speed. The war had supercharged industrial production, and once the fighting stopped, those same factories shifted to making consumer goods for a booming economy. By 1950, the US produced nearly 50% of the world's manufactured goods. Think about that. One country making half of everything on the planet. Cars from Detroit, steel from Pittsburgh, electronics from Silicon Valley, before it was even called that. If it had an engine, a circuit, or a steel frame, there was a good chance it was built in the United States. And this boom wasn't just good for companies, it was good for workers too. Manufacturing jobs paid well, came with benefits, and didn't require a college degree. In 1955, a factory worker at General Motors could afford a house, a car, and still have money left over for a comfortable life. At its peak in the late 1970s, manufacturing accounted for nearly 30% of all US jobs. Today, it's barely 8%. The US led global innovation. Ford revolutionized cars, Boeing modernized air travel, and IBM pioneered computing. America was the world's workshop, and it seemed like nothing could stop it. But then, things started to change. Slowly at first, then all at once. The decline of American manufacturing didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, steady process, fueled by a mix of outsourcing, automation, trade policies, and global competition. In the beginning, the warning signs were small. A few factories shutting down, a handful of companies shifting production overseas. But over time, these small shifts turned into an avalanche, wiping out millions of manufacturing jobs and reshaping the American economy. One of the biggest reasons for this decline was the rise of outsourcing. In the late 20th century, American companies began moving production overseas in search of cheaper labor and lower costs. It made business sense. Why manufacture in the US when making the same product in China or Mexico cost a fraction of the price? By the early 2000s, outsourcing had become the norm, and entire industries had relocated abroad. The impact was devastating. In 1979, US manufacturing employment peaked at nearly 20 million jobs. Today, that number has dropped to around 13 million. The textile industry, once a pillar of American manufacturing, collapsed as production shifted overseas. In 1990, half of all clothes bought in the US were made domestically. Now, that number is barely 3%. Electronics manufacturing suffered the same fate. Despite being an American company, Apple has never built an iPhone in the US. Every single device is assembled in China. But outsourcing alone doesn't tell the whole story. Even the factories that stayed in the US started employing fewer workers, thanks to the rise of automation. Technology transformed manufacturing, making production more efficient, but also eliminating the need for human labor. In 1980, it took 25 workers to produce $1 million worth of goods. Robots and AI-powered machines took over many repetitive tasks, especially in industries like car manufacturing. Auto factories that once employed thousands of people now rely heavily on machines, with only a fraction of the original workforce remaining. Even if factories returned, automation meant far fewer jobs. The manufacturing world had changed. Trade policies also played a crucial role in weakening American manufacturing. In the 1990s, free trade agreements like NAFTA encouraged companies to move production to Mexico, where wages were lower. Then, in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, opening the floodgates for even more American companies to shift their operations abroad. Unlike the US, which embraced free market capitalism, China played by a different set of rules. The Chinese government heavily subsidized its industries, giving its factories an unfair advantage over American competitors. The result was devastating for US manufacturing. Factories shut down, jobs disappeared, and America became increasingly reliant on imports. Today, the US runs a massive trade deficit, importing far more goods than it exports. For much of the 20th century, the US had no real rivals. But as China, Germany, Japan, and South Korea industrialized, they closed the gap. China aggressively expanded its industrial sector, investing in steel, electronics, and heavy machinery. South Korea became a leader in semiconductors and shipbuilding, while Germany dominated the auto industry. The US, meanwhile, fell behind. While American companies were shutting down factories, China was building new ones, equipped with cutting-edge technology. In 1990, the US produced 25% of the world's manufactured goods. Today, that number has dropped to 17%, while China now produces more than 30%. When the US started losing its manufacturing dominance, it wasn't just about factories shutting down. The impact rippled through the entire economy, reshaping the job market, deepening inequality, and even weakening America's position on the world stage. Manufacturing wasn't just another sector, it was the backbone of the middle class, the foundation of economic stability, and the key pillar of national security. Without it, the US found itself facing problems it hadn't fully anticipated. One of the most obvious consequences was the decline of good-paying jobs. Manufacturing jobs had been a ticket to the middle class for millions of Americans, especially those without a college degree. These weren't just any jobs, they provided stable incomes, benefits, and a path to home ownership. As factories shut down, entire towns collapsed. Places like Detroit, once a global hub for car production, became ghost towns. Unemployment soared, poverty increased, and many former factory workers found themselves stuck in low-paying service jobs, struggling to make ends meet. The US economy shifted from making things to providing services, but these new jobs, like retail or food service, offered lower wages and fewer benefits. The decline of manufacturing also widened economic inequality. In the past, factory workers could support a family on a single income. But as these jobs disappeared, wages stagnated and wealth became concentrated in cities that benefited from finance and technology. The divide between urban and rural America grew wider. Coastal cities like New York and San Francisco thrived, while industrial heartlands in the Midwest and South crumbled. The economic pain wasn't evenly distributed. If you lived in Silicon Valley, you barely noticed the change. But if you were in Ohio or Pennsylvania, it was devastating. Today, the US has one of the highest levels of income inequality among developed nations, and a big reason for that is the loss of stable manufacturing jobs. At the same time, the decline of American manufacturing made the country more dependent on foreign imports. In the 1950s, the US was largely self-sufficient. It made its own steel, cars, electronics, and textiles. Now, it imports nearly everything. Over 90% of America's shoes and clothing are made overseas. The US once dominated the semiconductor industry, but today it relies on Taiwan for over 60% of its advanced computer chips. This dependency became painfully clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, when supply chains collapsed. Suddenly, the US couldn't get basic medical supplies, auto parts, or even baby formula because so much of its production had been outsourced. Even national security became a concern. The Pentagon has warned that America's reliance on Chinese-made electronics and rare earth minerals poses a serious risk. If tensions with China escalate, the US could find itself cut off from crucial materials needed for everything from fighter jets to smartphones. Another major consequence was the weakening of US innovation. In the past, manufacturing and technological advancement went hand in hand. When factories were located in America, engineers worked closely with production teams to improve designs, experiment with new materials, and develop cutting-edge technologies. But as production moved overseas, so did innovation. When Apple outsources iPhone production to China, it doesn't just lose factory jobs, it also loses the expertise that comes with manufacturing. The same thing happened in industries like solar panels, batteries, and high-speed rail. China didn't just take manufacturing jobs, it became the global leader in entire industries that America once pioneered. This hollowing out of industrial expertise made it harder for the US to compete in the long run. Perhaps the biggest consequence of all was the impact on America's global influence. Manufacturing power has always been linked to geopolitical strength. In the 20th century, the US dominated global trade because it was the world's factory. It could produce more cars, more steel, and more weapons than any other country. That gave it immense economic and political leverage. But as manufacturing declined, so did America's ability to shape the global economy. China, on the other hand, followed the opposite path. It transformed itself into the world's manufacturing superpower, allowing it to dictate trade rules, control supply chains, and challenge US dominance. In 2000, China accounted for just 7% of global manufacturing. Today, that number is over 30%. China is now the largest producer of steel, electronics, and consumer goods. It has used its industrial strength to expand its influence, building massive infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America through its Belt and Road Initiative. The US, once the undisputed leader of the global economy, now finds itself playing catch-up. So, what does all of this mean for the future? America is at a crossroads. The consequences of losing its manufacturing power are clear. But is there a way to reverse this trend? The good news is that reshoring, bringing production back to the US, is already happening. In 2010, only about 6,000 jobs were brought back to the US through reshoring efforts. By 2022, that number had surged to over 350,000. Companies are realizing that the low cost of overseas production often comes with hidden risks: shipping delays, trade restrictions, and political instability. The COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call, showing just how fragile global supply chains can be. That shock has forced businesses to rethink their reliance on foreign production. At the same time, the cost advantage of manufacturing overseas isn't as strong as it used to be. Wages in China, once the go-to destination for cheap labor, have risen significantly. Meanwhile, new technologies like automation and AI-driven manufacturing have made it more cost-effective to produce goods in the US than ever before. The combination of these factors has made reshoring not just a patriotic idea, but a practical business decision. The US government is playing a major role in this shift. Several laws and policies have been introduced to incentivize domestic manufacturing. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law have all poured billions of dollars into rebuilding American industry. The CHIPS Act alone has committed over $50 billion to boost semiconductor manufacturing in the US, reducing dependence on Taiwan and China for these critical components. On top of that, Buy American policies are ensuring that federal projects prioritize US-made materials, further boosting domestic production. Private companies are responding to these incentives. Manufacturing construction spending has exploded in recent years, reaching $234 billion as of mid-2024, a 217% increase from 2019. This surge reflects major investments in semiconductor plants, electric vehicle battery factories, and other high-tech industries. CEOs are also on board. A recent survey found that 88% of American CEOs believe reshoring is essential for the country's economic future, and 78% have either already brought back production or are actively working on it. But while the momentum is strong, challenges remain. One of the biggest roadblocks is the shortage of skilled labor. Many American workers lack the training needed for modern, highly automated factories. For reshoring to succeed, there needs to be a massive push in workforce development through vocational training, apprenticeships, and partnerships between companies and educational institutions. Another challenge is global competition. Other countries, including China and the European Union, are also investing heavily in their manufacturing sectors, making it critical for the US to remain competitive through innovation and efficiency. Despite these challenges, the outlook for American manufacturing is improving. Economic forecasts predict a 4.2% increase in manufacturing revenues by 2025, with capital investments expected to grow by 5.2%. The shift won't happen overnight, but the foundation is being laid for a stronger, more resilient manufacturing sector. The US is making strides in reshoring, but the battle isn't over. Will these policies and investments be enough to rebuild American industry? Or has globalization changed the game forever? Only time will tell.